You need to know this. All eyes are on Germany now to save the global economy. The biggest economy in Europe, Germany, is under pressure to open up its treasury and save the Eurozone from collapse. Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski made an emergency appeal to Germany's, to the Germans yesterday in general, saying, "I demand of Germany that for your own sake and for ours, you help the Eurozone survive and prosper. You know full well that nobody else can do it. I will probably be the first Polish foreign minister in history to say so, but here it is. I fear German power less than I am beginning to fear German inactivity. You become Europe's indispensable nation." End of quote. But Germany is hesitant. One, they're not sure if they can bail out Europe on their own, and two, why spread all their wealth around to poorer nations when there's no assurance it could even work to stem the crisis? So for now, Europe creeps closer and closer to the edge, and if it falls, so too does the United States. So how do we get to this point? And now that we're here, how do we get out of this mess? Richard Wolff joins me now from New York. He's a professor of economics at the New School University in New York City and at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and the author of numerous books, including the brilliant Capitalism Hits the Fan, the Global Economic Meltdown and What to Do About It. Richard, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, and thank you for the kind words.
They're absolutely true. If Germany doesn't budge on this thing and the euro collapses or the EU begins to unravel, how does that impact us here in the United States?
Well, if it actually happens and if the Europeans begin to dissolve, the effect on the United States will be immediate and profound. American banks are, for example, deeply intertwined with their counterparts in Europe, and they will suffer. And American banks are already in very bad shape. They have little room for any kind of serious downturn. So right away, you'll see a seizing up of credit. You'll have something that'll look a lot like what the breakdown of the Lehman Brothers firm was a few years ago. Secondly, the Europeans buy a great deal from the United States, and they won't be able to do that. And finally, the Europeans are major producers of things we need here in the United States, and the whole interconnected world economy will take a tremendous blow if something as important as the European community has a severe economic contraction, which it may have.
But if, two questions apropos to that. First, if we're, for example, buying a lot of German manufactured goods and they're buying, raw material or whatever from us, how does that stop just because they're no longer in an alliance in the EU with France, for example? Wouldn't we just go back to bilateral trade like we used to have? And then secondly, the Bloomberg article, I believe it was today, it might have been in yesterday's online press, that laid out the $7.7 trillion. As you moused over the various points on their graphic, they identified the various banks that got that $7.7 trillion and how much money they made off it. And two of the largest banks in Germany were among the top 10, as I recall, that got money from our Fed. Couldn't our Fed simply run to the rescue?
Well, I think you have to see it in kind of stages. Part of the German problem is the problem of the world. We are now dependent on credit. Every government is in deep debt. That's part of this problem. Most corporations are in deep debt. Most consumers in the advanced part of the world carry huge amounts of debt. It means that without a free-flowing credit system, nothing can work, and the whole thing kind of grinds to a halt. The big problem in Europe is that banks, the center of the credit system, own the debt of countries that cannot or will not pay if the euro falls apart. That means the banks cannot lend money because they won't be able to get back what they invested in the government's debt, and so the ability for credit to be extended stops, and companies will not ship goods if they can't rely on the credit of the buyer, and the whole mechanism grinds to a halt. Now, in that situation, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, will try to rush in. but they already have problems. They rushed in a few years ago. The mass of the people in those countries, having watched the big banks be bailed out, being told now that they have to suffer an austerity to pay for it, are not eager to see another bailout of the same banks. So you have a political problem overlaying a credit problem, and this could mean the thing freezes up, and if that lasts for even a few weeks, all bets are off and the economic engine grinds to a halt.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. We heard last night that after World War II, we had a private debt to GDP ratio here in the United States. Our private debt represented a little more than 50% of GDP. And correct me if I'm remembering these numbers wrong, or if this doesn't seem right to you. And that it has, during this giant credit bubble that we had, particularly over the last decade and a half, it exploded up to a point of there was over 300% of GDP, just private debt in the United States. And that it's now deleveraged. You mentioned deleveraging. It has unwound by about 50%, so we're down to about 250% of GDP. But that means we've still had a massive amount of private debt that needs to be deleveraged over either a long period of time, it's like a 10 or 20-year depression, or very rapidly, which is a very deep depression. Does that all make sense to you?
Absolutely. We are in a phase that is called deleveraging. People cannot carry the level of debt they have. Wages are not going up, so people have no underlying economic income to carry debt. They have to reduce their debt. They took on more than they could. Hard times are here, more hard times are coming. So people are cutting back, which damages the economy. You know, we have an out-of-control economic system. We've had it for a long time. We let too much debt accumulate. We didn't give people the kinds of jobs and wages that would have made it unnecessary to borrow to provide the so-called American dream. And now we're reaping the reward of an out-of-whack system. I mean, the Occupy Wall Street people are right. 1% is doing great, but if 99% aren't, in the end, the difficulties of the 99% will undo even the wealth of the 1%.
Right. So to deleveraging, to reducing the debt, is this a matter of just, you know, working it out through time, over time, or is there a rip the scab off solution that's painful but short? Or is there, you know, I've heard people talk about jubilees, you know, let's just have massive debt forgiveness at the level of the consumer rather than at the level of the banksters as we did in 2008. Is that, you know, magical thinking or realistic?
Well, I think it's a measure of how serious the problem is. Most economists hope that the deleveraging will be slow and gradual, precisely so it doesn't explode the system. The great fear is that you'll have a big deleveraging. You know, in a way, when governments default, the way we discussed Greece may do it, that's a big act of quick deleveraging. You're reducing your debts by simply announcing to your creditors you're not going to pay. Right. Jubilee is just the same thing carried one step further. And Jubilee was invented thousands of years ago by the people then who realized that if you didn't intervene in this credit bubble, it would eventually destroy you. So they took the extreme act of canceling debts every few years just to prevent the kind of systematic extremes of wealth and poverty that markets and credit markets generate. And again, that's what's going on in the United States too. Before we shake our fingers at the Europeans, their problems are very similar to our own. Their present is likely our future.
Are their problems like ours because they followed the same flawed economic models that we did, or vice versa? I mean, did this start with Thatcher and Reagan, or does this precede that? What began this, and why the similarities?
Well,
on both sides of the Atlantic?
I think the basic similarity can be captured by an American phrase, and the phrase is called trickle-down economics. The idea is that when the capitalist system goes through its unstable ups and downs, what the government is supposed to do in the conventional notion is to come in and bail out the top, banks, corporations, the stock market, in the hope that the benefits will trickle down to the average working person, to the average little business, and so we'll get out of the mess. Most of the time, trickle down doesn't work. The top takes the benefits, takes the help, takes the bailout, and keeps it to weather the economic storm, leaving the rest of the society wondering when the trickle is supposed to happen. The Europeans did that, the Americans did that. It doesn't work because the bottom is too big, and the failure for the benefits to trickle down means the mass of people can't buy materials, cannot borrow money, cannot lend any money, and the failure of the bottom, which is now so large, is dragging down the top as well, but the people at the top don't want to face that they can't be the 1% anymore. If they don't equalize the way this economy works, they're going to take everyone down with them.
Judge Jed Rakoff blocked a settlement between the SEC and Citigroup this week, ruling that the public needs an actual trial, a criminal or civil trial, to find out exactly what happened. What might we learn from such a trial? We have about a minute and a half, sir.
I think the basic issue is, number one, that the financial industry is a place where an awful lot of shady business goes on. Number two, that having spent 20 years claiming that private enterprise is going to solve all our problems and the government should get out of the economy is a little bit like taking the only policeman in the situation who can control something and making him go away. And the result is people do what you know they will do if there's no one looking over their shoulder. And the third lesson of Judge Rakoff is, if you pit a government that has insufficient people doing the work, insufficient budgets, because everybody's cutting the government budget, you're going to leave a government supervisor with much less money and resources than the people they're supposed to supervise, which is what got Judge Rakoff so angry, because he was being required to make decisions that were patently unfair, that favored the very businesses that were supposed to be supervised. This is a system that's very seriously out of whack, and he at least was a judge with the ability to say so.
Just very quickly, just a few seconds, might this mean that those banksters could end up going to jail, and might there be contagion? Might other banks be dragged into this?
Well, it certainly opens the can of worms in that direction. Whether they don't have enough power to make sure all this goes away, only time will tell. Okay. But he was at least courageous enough to say this is a serious problem, and he won't be part of the usual cozy cover-up of what the financial sector often does.
Brilliant. Richard Wolff, thank you so much for being with us tonight, Dr. Wolff.
Thank you for the opportunity.